You know, I wish that we had a lot more of this in the world. Eloquent, thoughtful conservatives like Douglas Murray debating and dismantling these bubble dwelling intellectuals who have been led to believe and led others to believe that they're the eloquent ones, they're the thoughtful ones. But it turns out, I mean, we all know they're just shallow, they're just frauds. And the truth is, I mean, no matter how many awards that these people give each other, no matter how much some giant news for profit corporation pays them, in a format like this, man, you're only as good as your ideas. And this, I'm going to show you a pretty interesting debate. Before it happens, the audience is polled, and 52% of the audience believes that the mainstream media should be trusted. Now, in the comments, write down your own guesses as to how you think that's going to change or if it changes at all. But here's who's going to be debating, if you can call it that. First, there's this girl from the New York Times. Her name is Michelle Goldberg. She's given herself quite a few very impressive awards.
We got a lot of things wrong during COVID. But in terms of the big stories, if you paid attention to the mainstream media, you were likely to be much safer and much closer to the truth than if you followed the kind of contrarians, if you followed the people who were saying, don't trust the mainstream media, trust these alternative sources of information. You know, if you were saying that, for example, it was a common refrain, I think one that Matt made again and again throughout the Trump presidency, that people who were extremely alarmed about the prospects of authoritarianism, that people who believed that Donald Trump would try to overturn our constitutional order were hysterical. I think that the point of view of the hysterics is actually held up kind of well in light of January 6th.
Yeah. I think she actually believes them. It's unbelievable. We haven't even really begun, and I already don't exactly know what to say. I mean, hopefully, I think she's as low caliber as we get, but I mean, hopefully it gets better than that, because we also have a guy from the New Yorker called Michael Gladwell. Pretty accomplished guy, actually. 5 best-selling books, popular podcasts, and as far as lefty magazines go, full disclosure, I kind of actually like the New Yorker.
That's how seriously the paper took the commitment to accuracy in its pages. Now, Matt would have you believe that those two principles are no longer a part of the brief of the mainstream media. I would like to say to him, that's completely false. He is so far removed from the mainstream media that I think he has a naive view about what goes on inside those institutions. They remain committed to a professional set of ideals that they have held for decades.
He says Matt just doesn't understand the mainstream media. He's too far removed. He's naive, says the guy telling you how committed to truth and excellence the mainstream corporate media is. Now, I mean, one man's naivete is another guy's very rare common sense and reason, I guess. I mean, one of the so-called journalists who broke the Twitter files, the gentleman he's talking about, is Matt Taibbi.
My father had a saying, the story's the boss. In the American context, this means that if the facts tell you the Republicans were the villains in a political disaster, then you write it that way. If the facts point more at the Democrats, you write that. If they're both culpable, as was often the case for me when I investigated Wall Street for almost 10 years after the 2008 crash, you write the story that way. We're not supposed to thumb the scale. Our job is just to call things as we see them and leave the rest up to you. But we don't do that now. The story is no longer the boss. Instead, we sell narrative in a dysfunctional new business model. Once the commercial strategy of the news business was to go for the whole audience. A TV news broadcast was aired at dinner time, and it was designed to be watched by the entire family. Everyone from your crazy right-wing uncle to the sulking lefty teenager in the corner. This system had flaws, but making an effort to talk to everybody had benefits. For one thing, it inspired trust. Gallup polls twice showed Walter Cronkite to be the most trusted person in all of America. That would never happen with a newsreader today. With the arrival of the internet, some outlets found that instead of going after the whole audience, it made more financial sense to pick one demographic and try to dominate it. How do you do that? That's easy. You just pick an audience and feed it news you know they'll like.
I really like Matt. I mean, obviously a tremendous human, reasonable guy. And I don't even need to say it, but highly intelligent, right? All of these characteristics, they converge to ensure that the modern day American left are going to hate this guy. But I don't think they'll ever hate him as much as they hate Douglas Murray, because Douglas has all of those characteristics in spades. He's got it all, but he's also gay. And the left hates nothing more than a black or a woman or a gay, any protected class who has escaped the liberal plantation of the mind.
Now Canada has become really interesting. It became interesting in January and February of this year. Why? Because you had protesters in Ottawa. Really interesting. When people come out in large numbers, and you know what the job of reporters is? The job of reporters is to go out and say, why are you on the streets? What brought you here? Why are you here with your kids? Why have you got a bouncy castle in the middle of Ottawa? That's a bit strange. Ask them questions. Just find out the story. But you know what? The government didn't want that in Canada. Your Prime Minister decided in advance that these people were, what did he do? All the modern excommunications. They were Nazis, they were white supremacists, they were anti-Semites, they were probably homophobes, they were misogynists, they were probably transphobes, etc., etc., etc. He did all the things you do in the modern political age if you want to just defenestrate somebody who's awkward to you. And then he brings in the Emergency Powers Act. Now, at such a time, what would the mainstream media do? It would question it. It would question it. The Canadian mainstream media did not. The Canadian mainstream media acted as an amen chorus of the Canadian government. I will give you a couple of examples, but ladies and gentlemen, I could go on for hours with examples of this. You had a CBC host describing the Freedom Convoy as a, quote, feral mob. You had a Toronto Star columnist saying, quote, sorry for the language, it's a homegrown hate farm that was then jet-fueled by an American right-funded rat-fucking operation. Jesus, they can't even write at these papers anymore. CBC said that 2 Indigenous women were so scared to go outside in Ottawa because of racist violence didn't bother to mention that Indigenous drummers had led the truckers in an O Canada rendition. The National Observer said that the many black and Indigenous Freedom Convoy supporters were in fact duped by the truckers. The Globe and Mail reporter said, my 13-year-old son told me to tell protesters I'm not a Jew out of fear of anti-Semitic violence without mentioning that one of the leaders of the convoy was himself Jewish. Now, why is this so rancid? Utterly, utterly rancid and corrupt. Because in this country, your media, your mainstream media, is funded by the government. A totally corrupted system. In 2018, election year, coincidence, the Canadian media is given $595 million over 5 years. The Toronto Star estimated it was going to be getting $3 million from the government in the first half of the year. It went on and on. So you see, the mainstream, the government in Canada can tell people they can tell the banks to shut down people's bank accounts. Oh yeah, your government can do that, and if you're happy with that, just think about what would happen if the shoe was on the other foot. The government can do that, but in Canada, they can also tell the media what to do. And the media does the bidding of the Canadian government. That isn't a free society's media.
I mean, yeah, I'm not even going to add anything to that. I mean, the dude is stone cold super stud, completely brilliant. I mean, possibly the most intelligent living Brit. And there's some pretty smart Brits, but obviously, I mean, this should be good. I mean, this takes place in Canada, a place only a few years ahead of us, the United States, on the march towards socialism. So I'm sure that the people in the audience are going to love this thing. Before I get rolling, man, guys, if you haven't already, help the channel grow so we can reach as many people as possible. Just hit the like button. That really, really, really is appreciated.
Malcolm, you seem to think I've never worked in the mainstream media. I spent 15 years at Rolling Stone. I spent all that time writing 7,000-word features that had to be fact-checked every line. I'm absolutely familiar with the process of mainstream media, and that's why I'm so disappointed in what happened. The New York Times and the entire, basically, mainstream media spent years following a fake story about Donald Trump being in league with Vladimir Putin to fix the 2016 election. It was a wrong story. We have a leaked audio tape that was published in Slate.com where the editor of the New York Times says, well, we got caught a little flat-footed on that one because, our readers who want Donald Trump to go away are going to be disappointed about this. He says we built our entire newsroom around one story, and they got it wrong. There's no way to defend that kind of inaccuracy, and it only happens if everybody wants so badly for it to be true that they overlook all the guardrails that are in place. No serious journalist that I know looked at that story and didn't have qualms about it.
I was greatly amused by the affection Matt Taibbi has for the age of Walter Cronkite, which he seemed to hold up as a kind of golden moment. In that moment, the mainstream media was populated entirely by white men from elite schools. Why you would have had such affection and say that's the gold standard, and we should trust the mainstream media precisely at the moment when the mainstream media is least representative, is really puzzling to me. I would point out that at the height of Walter Cronkite's reign in American media, neither people like Michelle and I wouldn't have been on the stage, right? We weren't part of the conversation. So I don't know why we should hold such a kind of affection for that moment. I was also struck by the contradictions between the comments that both of you made. When Douglas said that he was very upset at the way the Canadian media acted as an amen chorus of the Canadian government with respect to the truckers, I would just point out that the reason Walter Cronkite was so beloved by people like Matt Taibbi's father and grandfather is that he was an amen chorus for the United States government. So the two of you should really get together in the next 5 minutes and work out your story. One last comment, and that is I was most amused by the particular subjects that seem to have excited the imagination and outrage of the two of you. I'll just list them before I go in my last 19 seconds. Donald Trump's relationship with Russia, the Canadian truckers, ivermectin, Jordan Peterson, and then something about this thing in... These aren't things driven by the mainstream media. These are obsessions of the non-mainstream media. Once again, work it out, guys.
Donald, first of all, are you really saying that Trump's relationship with Russia was not an obsession of mainstream media? It was basically the entire content of cable news for 3 years. There was almost, again, the editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, said, we built our newsroom around one story, that story. The New York Times doesn't get much more mainstream than that, I don't think.
We already know, man, the left loves to rewrite history. And I guess that makes sense. I mean, if you're not equipped to make history, if you can't intellectually do it, you may as well rewrite it as best you can, right? But the way Gladwell just rolled that off the tongue. I mean, you have to wonder if he really does believe that the media wasn't pushing Russia. I mean, it seems like he just isn't aware that they are almost solely responsible for Russia dominating the minds of compromised propaganda victims all over the world. And I don't see how that's possible. I mean, the guy works for the New Yorker. I mean, maybe he just doesn't read his own magazine. I don't know, but there was a pretty long span of time that something like 80% of the political cartoons had some sort of Trump-Russia element. And if you guys aren't familiar with the New Yorker, I mean, they're literally known for their political cartoons. Have been for basically the last 100 years. But here's the thing. I can let that slide pretty easily if it wasn't basically his only shtick, but the guy is a walking, talking liberal cliche. All the guy really did was demean Matt, strawman his argument, and say that anyone who thinks Cronkite was great is just a racist who shouldn't even be on the stage. Doesn't think he should be on the stage, is what he said. I mean, prototypical left-wing identity politics nonsense. He basically implies that in order for the media to be trusted, they got to look like you, which, I mean, it doesn't make sense. So, you know, the guy, he's just picking on Matt Taibbi. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. The first, he hates that people like Matt Taibbi even exist. People who eventually are going to be the reason guys like him don't exist, not in that business at least. I think there's that, and I think he actually chose Matt because, like we saw in Congress, the guy's maybe not the best toe-to-toe debater, you know, and when you think about it, most writers really aren't, and they write. Douglas, on the other hand, even a dummy from the New Yorker, knows not to play with Douglas Murray.
Malcolm, you did a little nasty jab there, I noticed, at Matt, by trying to pretend that Matt Taibbi is desperate for the era of white men in broadcasting. It takes a certain chutzpah to make that claim. But I don't see any reason why that is the case with Matt. I don't think that you are hankering desperately for a world of white news presenters. We've only just met, but you didn't give off that vibe to me. And when Malcolm says you've got to get your story right, guys, I know it's easy for a cheap laugh line, but I don't see why we do. We're two very different people with very different careers, interests, and much more. We've trodden very different paths across very wide swathes of this planet. And we don't need to get our story straight for you, or for this audience tonight, or be in lockstep. Differences of opinion, including on the same side, used to be cherished.
Dude, this dude does not play around. I mean, not only does he show the guy for exactly what he's doing, exactly what he is, just cheap tricks and cheap laughs, but he makes a great point. I mean, it's journalism. It's finding. It's delivering the truth. You know, you don't need to get a story straight with someone else before you decide what people need or want to hear. I mean, you just got to get it right. I mean, he's going to go back to the same well for the same lazy laugh lines, and just watch Michelle's face. She looks actually pretty uncomfortable. I think she knows she's on the losing team.
I was astonished to listen as Matt Taibbi doubled down on his defense of Walter Cronkite. I feel like there should be a giant picture of Walter Cronkite behind. And he said, the most incredible quote was, Walter Cronkite, the era of that era in journalism was distinguished by journalists, quote, making the effort to talk to everybody. Now, he's talking about the 1950s and 60s. I just wanted to make a short list of the people who were not spoken to by journalists in the 1950s and 60s. And you may want to add some, if I miss some, black people, women, poor people, gay people, people with mildly left-wing views. I mean, words fail me when somebody, when it presented with a critique of his rather idiosyncratic position on Walter Cronkite, comes back and says, oh, no, there's more to my great love of this man. The other thing that struck me...
This guy's, it's probably not stupid, so I think Michelle's probably not the only one who realizes that they're on the losing team. I mean, I don't even know what this guy is doing. Just put all his straw man laziness aside. He really should read some history, man. The 60s, especially. I mean, to hear him tell it, everyone was conservative and white. It's almost, I think he actually believes this stuff.
Yes, there are processes. Fact-checking is important. I do it. I hire fact-checkers to do it. But this is not the standard process for all mainstream media institutions anymore. We don't do it as much as we used to. Part of that is for financial reasons.
Wait, I can't sit here and let you make these statements that without any kind of... We don't do that as much as we used to for financial reasons. I mean, I worked at The New Yorker. The New Yorker, if anything, spends more money on fact-checking today than it did in the past. I would have thought, with my first book, I didn't hire a fact-checker, but then I observed the number of errors in it. I also observed that the nature of the journalism world in which we live, the scrutiny of journalists is such that it's really perilous not to have a fact-checker. And so now I have fact-checkers. Many other people, I think, have observed the same thing, that there is now so much attention paid to the accuracy of things that writers say that you'd better make sure you don't have errors in your... So, I mean, Matt, I understand that you do have this wonderful nostalgia for the way things used to be, but I think that you need to fact-check some of your nostalgic notions about the wonderful world of the 1950s. Who was watchdogging the New York Times in the 1950s? Nobody was. There was a tiny little universe of people now watchdog institutions like that, and so they have a higher commitment to the truth.
So first of all...
Hold on, Matt. Let's bring Douglas in on this. I just want to hear his voice.
Doug is speechless.
I'm never speechless. It's not a problem I suffer from. I can't sit here and listen to Malcolm Gladwell talking about fact-checking and the importance of it. Not to get too mean, Malcolm. I read your book, David and Goliath. The chapter on Northern Ireland is more filled with inaccuracies than any other chapter in a non-fiction book I have read. It is, having written a not very well selling, but widely acclaimed book on Northern Ireland myself, my book on Northern Ireland didn't sell anywhere near as much as yours did, Malcolm. But mine was filled with facts. And
Well, now.
your chapter on Northern Ireland was so filled with inaccuracies. Irish historians ripped it apart. Would that you had a fact checker, Malcolm. Would that you did your own research. But anyway, let me get back to another point.
I must say, you do a very good job of it. But you must say, you do have a tendency to accuse those who disagree with your opinion.
No, it's not disagreement.
It's
not disagreement, Malcolm. You didn't know that the provisional IRA were responsible for 60% of the deaths in the Troubles. There were basic things you just didn't know, Malcolm. No. I'm sorry, it's not my fault, it's yours. And your fact checkers.
I didn't know that the function of this debate was to rehash the accuracy of a chapter in a book that I wrote.
Well, you were the one that started talking about fact checkers. I'm simply saying, why don't you employ some?
I suspect
or your publishers.
Douglas,
why don't I make the point I wanted to make other than that?
Briefly, yes. Good Lord.
Take the Hunter Biden story.
Oh, here we go.
Okay?
I'm sorry.
Of course you don't want to hear it.
Is there no end to the kind of Twitter stuff you guys are going to dredge up?
Of course you don't want to hear it, Malcolm. Of course you wouldn't, because it goes against your ideological presumptions. That story was a big story, okay? It was a big story. The New York Post, which I write for, but the New York Post, America's oldest newspaper, was silenced on Twitter, was silenced across the media. You know, the Washington Post has now picked it up. It's saying that, yeah, the laptop's true. But why didn't the media pick it up before? Why didn't they call up people? Why didn't they check whether the emails were accurate? Because they didn't want Biden to lose the election. He was their guy. And they weren't going to screw that up.
That's exactly right, man. And unbelievably, I mean, they have not relented. He is still their guy. Somehow, some way, you'd think that having to defend him in Afghanistan, having to run cover for him on the border, ignore his kid's laptop, ignore his family's alleged crimes, pretend that the poorest man in Congress isn't now an unexplained millionaire. You'd have to pretend like his own Justice Department didn't print an entire report about him being a well-meaning old man with a poor memory for the sole intent of absolving him of actual crimes. I mean, these are dedicated people. They are in it to win the game, man. I mean, just started with the laptop, but I mean, the story has not changed. I mean, and here we have Michelle explaining that we've got this whole laptop thing all wrong.
He was their guy. And they weren't going to screw that up.
But I do want to talk about the Hunter Biden laptop, because I actually was telling Malcolm, we were talking this morning, and I said, I bet they're going to want to talk about the Hunter Biden laptop. And he said to me, really? Who would care about that? Yeah, the security experts who examined the data for the Post struggled to reach definitive conclusions about the contents as a whole, including whether all of it originated from a single computer or could have been assembled from files from multiple computers and put on the portable drive. So the media has covered this, but they have also been, I think, careful, given the fact that this stuff still cannot be authenticated. And I spoke at the very beginning about the media kind of trying to self-correct, sometimes to a fault.
Just think about what you're hearing here, man. The Hunter Biden laptop, which is literally the premier example of a broken and corrupt system, where you had shadowy government agencies working with big tech and big media to actively suppress a story that literally should have cost them the election. If polling is accurate, it would have cost them the election. I mean, this woman shows up with notes on the subject because she knew she would have to defend her colleagues over this. But the other propagandists didn't think any poor peasant even still cared about something so played out and so unimportant in his mind, And she also tells us that they even got together to, as Malcolm put it earlier in the event, get their stories straight.
You're kind of, oh my God, what a yawnaroo the whole Hunter Biden story is. How boring to talk about the idea of corruption at an epic scale in the first family. How boring. Who would want to harp on about that? Let me try the counterfactual on you. It's October 2020. And a huge number of emails are suddenly dumped, revealing unbelievable scandal in the Trump family. I don't want to concentrate on the dick pics and the crack and stuff. Never mind about Don Jr. if he'd been doing that. Let's just focus on the emails. There was a very easy way, Michelle, as you know, to certify whether this stuff was true. You could call up anyone on the email chains and say, did you get this email? They didn't bother with any of that stuff. They'd have been excited as hell across most of the mainstream media if this had been emails from Donald Trump's son saying, and I'm no Trump fan, let's not get into that cheap rut. But if it had been Don Jr. saying to his child, you've no idea what I've done for this family, the demeaning things I've gone through, I have to give half of everything I earn to my dad. Oh, you're Nauru, definitely. Who'd care about that? No, the point is simply that this was one of the occasions in recent years where the mainstream media showed its transparency as a political organization. That's why we care.
Okay. Well, you know, I was struck once again in listening to our opponents by how much their arguments resemble the kind of classic structure of a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy theory is a theory in which one assumes a degree of unanimity and collaboration amongst one's foes, right? The conspiracist speaks of those who disagree with himself or herself as if they had a single voice. And there are numerous really unpleasant examples of this. This is not one of those. This is a much milder, more naive variant on the traditional conspiratorial model. But nonetheless, when Matt and Doug speak about the mainstream media, they're acting as if there's a big room, possibly in New York or in Washington, D.C., or maybe in between, so that each party has equal access to the room, in which everyone gathers every morning and makes up the agenda for the day, right? And the people fly in from the big news networks, and someone from CBC comes down, and this cabal of high-minded, well-paid, elite white, as it turns out, journalists, some of them, the ones that Matt seems to have such affection for, gather together and set the agenda for the country.
Keep in mind, man, this is what an intelligent, enlightened, tolerant, and powerful leftist actually sounds like. I mean, Kamala Harris grade word salads, where he just labels everyone else just conspiracy theorists and racists and pining for the rich white men who would have actually told the truth about the Hunter Biden crimes. You'd think he would have learned his lesson.
It's so strange hearing you debate, Malcolm, because you listen to nothing that your opponents say. It's quite extraordinary. I've met it before, but never quite so badly as it occurs in you. You keep saying things that neither of us have said, and then you try to pathologize what we say. You decide to say things like, it's a conspiracy theory. If it comes from this side, it's a conspiracy theory. You say, we don't do our research. We're just conspiracy theorists. Apparently mild dose of it, he says, in his excellent medical-like analysis of his opponents. We just have a mild dose. No, Malcolm, why don't you listen to what comes out of our mouths and try to learn something from it, as I am with you this evening? But at the moment, all I get is you dismissing every single story we come up with, every egregious failure of the mainstream media. I've given you a definition of what I think of as the mainstream media, so your attempt to claim that we haven't answered it yet is just another straw man in your massive legion of straw men you keep creating this evening. But I beg you to actually consider the fact that what we are describing is, even if you think not as accurate as you would like, an expression of a problem that is going on in our societies. Functioning liberal democracies need to have trust in their media. And the best that your side has been able to come up with so far tonight is to say, we get things wrong quite often, but you should trust us.
They can't even say that because they honestly don't believe that they ever get things wrong. I mean, take, again, the laptop, for example. I mean, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but years after the Post was censored and silenced over that story, other papers and networks just quietly reported that they've just discovered through diligent effort that the Hunter Biden laptop was real, without any mention that they ever said it wasn't. And here they are. They don't believe that they actually get things wrong. And they absolutely don't believe that anyone, And by anyone, I mean anyone that actually matters, wouldn't trust them. I mean, anyone who doesn't is just a conspiracy theorist, and obviously those people just don't matter.
No shortcut to trust in media. The only way to get it is by doing a good job over and over and over again, not getting things wrong, and when you do get things wrong, admitting it. There's no other way to do it in media. Malcolm is talking about conspiracy theories. Let's talk about a story that was huge in America for years. This idea that Donald Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, was making visits to Prague. Now, this came from the infamous Steele dossier. If you read the dossier, basically the idea is Trump sent his lawyer to go meet with hackers and Kremlin representatives in Prague, and Steele says that they would preferably be Romanian hackers who would afterwards retreat to Bulgaria, where they could use that country as a bolt hole to lie low. If that's not a conspiracy theory, I don't know what is. This story was taken seriously by every major news organization in America for years on end with no evidence. And he accuses us of being conspiracy theorists. It's preposterous.
It is preposterous, man. But remember, I mean, whether it's Russia or whether it's Donald Trump selling nuclear secrets to some Australian billionaire, or it's Trump leading an insurrection, or Joe Biden funding a genocide. I mean, it's not a conspiracy theory when it's the left doing it. That's just getting it wrong, but getting there first is what they do. And I don't know. For me, this is not going too well for the mainstream team. I mean, the common sense team has brought receipt after receipt, and all the good guys have established is that Matt really likes Walter Cronkite, but it's only because he's white, of course, but I don't know. Maybe they have more.
Here's what I think the debate boils down to. And that is that our opponents believe that the mainstream media they're concerned that the mainstream media, to the extent that they have told us what it is filled with people who don't think like they do, and that fact makes them uncomfortable. And in support of this, they have given us a long list of rather predictable hot-button topics taken from their Twitter feed. And my question was, what would make them happy? So what would restore the trust of Matt and Doug in the mainstream media? And I think with Matt, the answer is obviously he would like, if the world resembled 1955 again, that would fill him with joy. Doug would like more stories on the Hunter Biden laptop.
4 times they're going to play the race
But more
card?
seriously,
Really?
I think that they would be...
Well, Malk.
Professional fight.
And he's down again and in serious trouble.
I'm going to try to take this more seriously than you did in your endless creation of straw men, which just is ceaseless this evening, and address what I think is the real problem we have in our century in terms of information technology. Having different opinions is so 20th century. This century, we have different facts, and it's lethal. It's absolutely lethal for the functioning of society. And if you want to see how lethal it is, look at the situation in America, where not just the media, but every institution, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the Supreme Court, every institution, you decide whether it's for your side or not. It's disastrous for society, but it starts with the facts. And when the facts go wrong, or you become glib about them, or decide that it's just the facts that will suit your side, or pretend you're playing a game of honesty and are not actually playing a game of honesty, everything else in the society can go to hell. This side has not been saying any of these straw men that you've been so kindly creating this evening, Malcolm. We've been saying that the mainstream media cannot be trusted. That is all. We're not saying don't read it. I repeat, we're not saying don't absorb it. Of course, you'd be an idiot to say that. What, you think we're only going to read Substacks for the rest of life? There's not even time. But the mainstream media is currently failing. It is failing you, the public. It is failing its employees. It's failing at its central task. You quoted one example of what journalism was meant to consist of. I would quote another.
what George Orwell said. It's out on his statue outside the BBC. Sadly, the employees do not read it every morning before going in. But George Orwell famously said that the job of a journalist was to tell people facts they don't want to hear. The problem we have in our century coming up is that people will be paying for and absorbing only the facts they want to hear. The argument we are making is one of hygiene, basic hygiene in the media, in the mainstream media. I don't want to blow it up. I don't want an end to it or anything like it. I spent a significant amount of my life in the mainstream media. We just want it to be honest. We just want it to be factual. We don't want it to chase its own prejudices. We just want it to speak truth, whatever that is. That's not so radical.
Here's the thing, man. If you're a dim-witted, overpaid leftist propagandist, there's no combating that, man. You don't have the facts. You don't have the truth. You don't have the intelligence. You could probably guess the results. I mean, especially up there in poor old Canada. When this started, Malcolm and Michelle had 52% of the audience that would trust them without knowing them, just based on who they work for and what they represent, right? After watching them and hearing them, 33% of the audience would trust them and their corporate media. And honestly, I honestly can't believe that they could get even 5% after that. But, you know, there are those of us that really do like to be lied to. I mean, the corporate media, obviously, it's dying. And they can blame streaming services. They can blame the public's perceived aptitude. That's what they say. They can blame whatever they want. But the truth is, it's dying because it continues to employ puppets that are just beholden to agenda and profit. And the alternative is people like Matt Taibbi and Douglas Murray. And these are remarkable people putting out remarkable stuff. You know, I mean, I don't know. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget, be a part of our growth. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Most importantly, share the channel. I'll see you in the next one.